Question: on a residential 2-story composition asphalt shingle roof, you discovered that you could fit more modules by orienting them in landscape mode, and you are using a standard rail system. The rail instructions say that the rail must be mounted perpendicular to the rafters, which go from the ridge to the eaves. What must be taken into consideration before mounting the modules? Okay, before we even read these things, let's just kind of look through this a little bit. And it's a 2-story, it's asphalt shingles. I think you know what that means. That's just your typical residential rooftop, what you're dealing with here, asphalt shingles. Yes, they are made out of some asphalt, which is actually a fossil fuel material, but rather than burning it, it's nice to live under it. You're going to go landscape, and then it says that the rails must be perpendicular to the rafters, and the rafters go from the ridge to the eaves. So, the ridge, that's the top of the roof, that pointy place, and then the eaves, that's down there by the gutters. So the rafters, which is really typical for this type of a roof, go to the ridge to the eave, and the rails, it said, must be perpendicular. So you got your sloped roof, and then the rails are going to go in the same direction as the ridge and the eaves. They're not going to go from the ridge to the eaves. They're at 90-degree angles from that. So what do we do? And of course, you have to follow instructions. That's just what you have to do. Rail instructions have to be followed. That's something that the National Electrical Code says, and just something that you always have to do is follow instructions for the equipment that you're using, because that's how the equipment was tested and listing. And then also, let's look at the ending part of this question. What must be taken into consideration before mounting the module? So what are we going to take into consideration? This is not what to do, but what to take into consideration. And A is, do the manufacturer's instructions let you mount modules by connecting to the short edges? So think about that. A PV module is a rectangle. I haven't seen a square module or a triangle module in a long time. And so with a rectangle, what you have is you've got longer edges on two sides that are opposite of each other and shorter edges on two sides that are opposite of each other. And so if we think about that, we have the roof and we have the rails going with the ridge. They're perpendicular to the rafters that are going ridge to eave. So if we want to mount the PV module's landscape, that means we have to attach to the short edges. In fact, let's look at this right now. This is a little picture of an installation manual. And so here we are mounting to the short edges. So like the rafters are coming up and down like the ridge. And this is what you see if you're standing on the street looking up at that roof. It looks like it's landscape. You know how you do your printer? You have portrait, which would be turning this thing at a 90-degree angle. And then we have landscape. And so we call these edges the long edges, and then we call these edges the short edges. And typically, you see people mounting things in portrait on these typical residential rooftops that you see in the United States of America. That's because the rafters are going up to down, from the ridge to the eave. Then the rails are going perpendicular. And so if you mounted to the long edges, then you don't need as much rail per module, because this way, we need the rail to be at least as long as the long edge for each module. And if we turned the module at 90 degrees, we would just need the rail to be as long as the short edge. So it would take less rail. That's one cool thing. And another thing is they say it's a little bit more stable. If you went to structural engineering school, you might understand this one, but it's a little bit more stable when you mount it to the long edges. So you could see here mounted to the short edges. There's just lots of room for things to wobble with the wind blowing on it and that kind of stuff. So you need more rail, and it might be a little bit less stable. So you have to check the installation manual to make sure that it's okay to mount to these short edges. That sounds like a good thing to me. But let's see if we have any better answers. Are the rafters 24 inches on center? So usually they are. That's 2 feet, and that's usually the way they say it. 24 inches on center. I used to joke with people and go, is it 24 inches also on edge? That's just what they say, center to one rafter to the center of the next rafter. And if you're looking for the right edge of the rafter, it would be the same thing. But anyway, they call it 24 inches on center. It's really typical, but if they were 18 inches on center, that would even be more stable. So that's probably not the best answer. And usually, too, I mean, it would be really unusual if somebody attached like to every rafter with every rail. I mean, I've never even seen it done before to have a post every 24 inches. And so typically people are going to skip a few rafters. And so maybe they'll have something attaching to the rafters every 6 feet or every 4 feet. It matters how strong the rafters are, how strong the rails are, how strong the wind is. And usually what's going to happen is you get into that installation manual for the racking system, and then you look up your wind zone, you look up your rafter and your rafter spacing and your rafter span, all that kind of stuff. And then you figure how often you have to attach to a rafter. So this is not the answer that we're looking for. I don't think A is much better than B. Let's look over at C. Do the rails have splice kits that allow for expansion? And these are kind of cool things, these splice kits. And let's just kind of take a little bit to tell you what these splice kits are. Is each rail is going to be so long. And so maybe it will take 4 PV modules, and if you wanted to go further, then you can attach 2 pieces of rail together. And if you attach 2 pieces of rail together, then you can go twice as far. And if you go really, really far, then you have to allow for expansion. And one way of allowing for expansion is just to have a space between a couple of rails. So just leave a little space in there. But there's another way where they take these things called splice kits. Those are the things that splice the rails together. And then they'll attach it to one rail and not the other. And then it'll kind of like have some room for expansion and contraction. However, you don't clamp your PV module over that expansion joint, because then it's not going to expand and contract right if you're clamping a module to both sides of it. And then the other one, the last one here, D, is to use 3 rails per module. And so let's just kind of take a look and see what that would look like. So here's 1 rail, there's 2 rails, put a third one in the middle. And you know what is funny? There was once a PV module that had instructions that required 3 rails per module. Kind of crazy, very unusual, but it has happened. And so another thing too is you look for the PV module, and then you also look for the rail instructions, and they can be different, and hopefully they can let you do the same thing, whatever it is. And so another thing that a lot of times you will see is when you're clamping down onto the short edge or the long edge, there'll be a distance where it's too far from the edge or too close to the edge. And so like, can you bring it all the way up to the end of the edge? Can you have it all the way in the middle? I mean, it would look kind of unstable if you just had 1 rail here and 1 rail there and then no other rails. I've seen stuff like that before. And that's when people were taking rails and putting them right on top of the rafter. So not perpendicular to the rafter, but right on top of the rafter. And then they can only put the rail every 24 inches. And then they just kind of ran into problems, and it looked kind of funny. It kind of reminded me of diving boards. If you had a PV module that had a rail here and a rail there, and then no room for another rail there because it's just the way the rafters fit and stuff like that. And so these are the installation instructions. And you have to always follow instructions. That's always a good test question. Follow instructions. And so I hope you enjoyed this explanation of question